Hi, everybody. Welcome to our introductory forum on wage abolition. Our initial presentation will be about 20 minutes long, and the rest of our allotted time will be devoted to questions and discussion. If you have questions or comments, as many questions or comments as you like, you can please put them in the chat as you are willing and able. And if you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook, you are welcome to leave comments and we'll try to see them on those pages, but we can't make any promises. A little bit about us. Solidarity Collective, Solidarity House Cooperative is the worker-owned media team of Solidarity Collective, which is the host of tonight's event. The event is also co-sponsored by Southeast Wyoming Democratic Socialists of America, of whom, if you wish to get more information, you can visit their Facebook or Twitter pages as well, or you can email them at seWydsa@protonmail.com. That's seWydsa@protonmail.com. And in a few minutes, we will put that email address in the chat in the Zoom room as well. Solidarity Collective, is a commune and intentional community in Laramie. We offer collaborative space, educational events, places to stay and live, organizing space, and media production for those fighting for a better world, a world without capitalism. You can support efforts like tonight's Wage Abolition Forum and our many other efforts by subscribing to our Patreon for $5 a month or more. And you can go to patreon.com/solidarityhouse for more information on that. You can also email us for more information at solidaritycollectiveyo@gmail.com. That's solidaritycollectiveyo@gmail.com. This presentation will be available via podcast and Facebook and YouTube video after we are done. My name is Matt. I'm one of the members of Solidarity Collective, and I'm joined tonight by Derek and Sean. Derek will begin the presentation in a moment by discussing the significance of wage abolition to the socialist movement in general. Sean will follow with detailed analysis of why, in the context of the capitalist system, wages are unjust and undesirable. I will follow Sean with a basic outline of alternatives to the wage system, and then Derek will conclude by asking whether the struggle for higher wages is compatible or incompatible with the struggle to abolish the wage system. Should workers continue to fight for higher wages while also fighting for the ultimate abolition of the wage system? Are those goals compatible or incompatible? And then we'll have further discussion. So to begin, we have Derek.
Hi, everybody. Derek here. The abolition of the wage system is a long-time goal of anti-capitalist movements. This goal may sound fantastical and utopian, but what we want people to understand is that a lifetime of indoctrination and psychological programming by hegemonic capitalism is designed not only to encourage us to embrace capitalism on an intuitive level, but to mold us into creatures who are incapable of living our best lives, where we would be able to authentically make choices, form relationships, and build communities that are free from moneyed interests. We often use the terms alienation and atomization to refer to the disastrous effects capitalism has on the human psyche and social behavior. Therefore, initially conceiving of a socioeconomic system that is not hinged on working for wages can be difficult. To us, the wage system is a defining characteristic of capitalism. When the means of production are allowed to be privately owned by individuals, these individuals are given an abhorrently unequal share of social power. They are the ones who dictate wage levels, they are the ones who get a say as to where and how to build, and they are incentivized by the capitalist system to retain and increase their power by keeping wages low enough that their workers are too desperate to object to them and by prioritizing their profits over the well-being of society. This is why we are adamant that the climate crisis that the Earth is facing is a result of capitalism, not the inherent result of humanity. The Earth can provide for billions, but not billionaires, as they say. To us, being anti-capitalist and being anti-wages is one and the same. In 1890, two English socialist groups, the Social Democratic Federation and the Fabian Society, both signed the Manifesto of English Socialists, which contained the pledge, quote, "We look forward to an end forever to the wages system." Marx and Engels continually asserted that piecemeal reforms could never achieve the transformation to a non-exploitative society, and that slogans such as a fair day's pay for a fair day's work were actually counterproductive because they tacitly accepted the inherently exploitative nature of capitalism. End quote. I'm going to end this introductory section to wage abolition by reading the preamble to the organizational constitution of the Industrial Workers of the World, a militantly anti-capitalist industrial union which has been organizing workers for the past 115 years, which eloquently summarizes the need for working class unity in the struggle for wage abolition. Quote, "The working class and the employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of the working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things of life. Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the workers of the world organize as a class, take possession of the means of production, abolish the wage system, and live in harmony with the earth. We find that the centering of the management of industries into fewer and fewer hands makes the trade unions unable to cope with the ever-growing power of the employing class. The trade unions foster a state of affairs which allows one set of workers to be pitted against another set of workers in the same industry, thereby helping defeat one another in wage wars. Moreover, the trade unions aid the employing class to mislead the workers into the belief that the working class have interests in common with their employers. These conditions can be changed and the interest of the working class upheld only by an organization formed in such a way that all its members in any one industry, or in all industries if necessary, cease work whenever a strike or lockout is on in any department thereof, thus making an injury to one an injury to all. Instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, we must inscribe on our banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wage system, end quote. And with that, we give you Sean.
Hey everyone, I'm Sean. So I'm going to talk about the more specific reasons about why we should oppose the wage system. First of all, none of the factors used to determine wages are just or rational. Wages are determined by a social relation that privileges the class with power. They're not an objectively rational outcome of work as such. Why should the cost of reproducing labor, the necessary goods we need to live, which are produced by labor, plus the existing physical capital, also produced by labor, equal profit to the capitalist? Again, this is a historical social relation rather than some objective rational fact. 2, wages are a means of stealing the value of labor from the worker. Since there would be no value without humans working with or maintaining machines, or without time spent producing things, there would be no new human value. Labor is the source of value, but only the cost of reproducing labor according to minimal established standards of living goes to the working class under the existing system. They work but don't get the full value of their work. 3, the wage system is undemocratic. Workers should have a say in what profit is otherwise spent on. Surplus, as it exists now, or what's produced beyond what we need to live, is currently the private preserve of individual capitalists rather than a democratically allocated part of the whole social wealth. It is production for the maximization of exchange value versus what workers or society decides is useful. There's no democratic decision-making involved. 4, the wage system pits workers against one another. In terms of the wage system itself, workers have to compete for jobs and wages, which is the reason why, for example, scabs in strikes offer to work for less than what the strikers are currently making. So workers compete against each other rather than collaborate around their shared interest. In terms of the historically uneven development of capitalism, my interest in, for example, inexpensive consumer goods is at odds with the interest of workers in the global south who make my clothes or produce my smartphone. 5, the wage system serves to maintain class divisions that are matters of life and death. So wages have been kept stagnant for a long time now, and the cost of living and housing and medical care is rising. A more specific example would be the tiny cost of production of insulin, for example, plus the average rate of profit in the pharmaceutical industry and intellectual property rents deriving from that equals death for many because they can't afford the cost of this objectively rather inexpensive good. 6, wages tend to decrease as capitalism decays. There's, in Marxist theory, the theory of the tendency of the rate of so as the ratio of fixed capital to labor costs increases, less new value is produced. There's also global competition between capitalists driving the wages down, and accumulation of value for the sake of accumulating even more value puts a constant pressure to reduce real wages. There's also the need for political and spatial fixes to address this. For example, labor arbitrage or offshoring and structural adjustment in the periphery to attempt to slow the decline of profit. And so to conclude, Marx, in the quote about the abolition of the wages system, notes that workers' struggles for the standard of wages are incidents inseparable from the whole wages system, that in 99 cases out of 100, their efforts at raising wages are only efforts at maintaining the given value of labor, and the necessity of debating their price with the capitalist is inherent to their condition of having to sell themselves as commodities. They ought not to forget that they're fighting with effects, but not the causes of those effects, that they're slowing the downward movement, but not challenging its direction, that they're applying palliatives, not curing the malady. And that's all I have.
So if not wages, then what? What would we replace the wage system with? All of these are derivatives of the assumption that we can reach a state of the world where workers are no longer competing with one another for wages and no longer debating the finer points of the wage system with the capitalists. There are a number of different options, all of which are premised on worker empowerment. First, obviously, we could keep and modify the wage system and radically alter how wages are determined. For example, we could guarantee a living wage and then increase incentives for socially significant reasons like needing more people in one industry or another. Now, automation is likely to gradually decrease the spheres where such work could or should be incentivized. And even if we concluded that material incentives were good because they increase total social good, well, as we've talked about, wages are not necessarily a good way to incentivize socially needed work. But at any rate, it's obvious that we could, perhaps in the short term, make the wage system much more fair than it is without eliminating it. But there are other options. We could institute some sort of universal income. Most of us have heard of UBI, or universal basic income. Universal basic income, in theory, uses the total wealth of society to generate dividends to each member of society. There are lots of debates about how to generate that dividend, how to prevent UBI from becoming a means of social control without worker or popular empowerment, how to prevent UBI from causing inflation or rent-seeking behavior on the part of landlords and capitalists, and so on. But if capitalism were overthrown, providing all people with a minimum amount of credit through periodic payments might make sense. It might seem reasonable. Or third, instead of a UBI, communities could ensure universal access to meeting basic needs: food, education, healthcare, housing, transportation, and other necessities, and even some so-called luxuries like art, entertainment, and recreation, which are just as much necessities for human beings. Those things could be socialized and made universally available, making wages obsolete, at least as a means of meeting basic needs. And finally, and certainly not finally, there are other ideas, but finally here for today, consider worker ownership. So worker cooperatives tend to be, even in this system, more successful and more profitable, both materially and spiritually for workers than regular private firms are in the present system. And although current worker-owned cooperatives operate in a market economy, even in that economy, workers who co-own their own businesses, and frequently even workers who work for other worker-owned businesses, are given both more control over their working conditions and more equitable shares of the money the businesses make, in a way that connects them to their work better than mere shareholders are connected. This is why many socialist theorists believe that current worker cooperatives are perhaps a model for a post-capitalist economy. Some important things to remember here, though. First of all, it's up to us. It's important to keep in mind the role of democratizing the economy. If the economy itself were under democratic control, with criteria like meeting needs and remaining sustainable, then any outcome, almost by definition, would be able to meet more people's needs than in the present system. The point is that we would determine what we receive for work. We would determine that together through democratic deliberation, not some mystical law of nature or the profit needs of a few capitalists. In order to do this, we would also have to center our struggles against racism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, ableism, and overthrow colonialism and return stolen land to indigenous people. Another thing to keep in mind is that vestiges of the old economic order might remain for some time in the transition to a new economy. Socialists generally believe that vestiges of the old distributive systems might exist until we specifically overthrow them, and the wage system may be a part of this. A revolution against capitalism and the establishment of a cooperative and sustainable economy to replace it is not then a one-off event, but is a continuing revolution with no end as we progressively eliminate more and more vestiges of material hierarchy. Should socialists still fight for higher wages?
Yeah, that's a significant question that's posed to us. That is whether or not we should keep fighting for increased wages when we could spend all that effort working to abolish the wage system altogether. So this question is an open question. It's worthy of discourse. And you'll probably pick up on what my opinion is, but I'm not going to come out and tell you what the right answer is. The two major schools of thought are, on one hand, fighting for increased wages can be thought of as part of the battle for wage abolition rather than a separate effort. Material gains are good for the working class. They give us some power over our bosses, and they put us in less desperate economic circumstances, thereby increasing our ability to fight for further advances. It may be seen like the snowball effect, where the working class gains more power and popularity with every small victory along the way. So if working 40 hours a week were truly able to meet the material needs of the average worker, we would have so much more time and energy to give to labor organizing and, chip away at that mandated 40-hour work week until it's more in our favor. So a saying that I like to repeat is like, think 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours to plot the overthrow of the capitalist class. On the other hand, however, the other side of the argument, working for increased wages can be seen as simply tinkering with the machinery of death rather than dismantling it. In this view, all the time and energy being used to fight for higher wages would be better spent used to abolish the wage system altogether. Another aspect of this pushes back against the idea of the reformist snowball effect, arguing that small advances and compromises with the capitalist class tend to take the steam out of true anti-capitalist movements, and people making small victories, such as now being able to earn enough that we feel like we don't have to sift through trash or be on government aid to survive, tricks us into thinking we have won the war, when in fact the majority of the value of our labor is still going into our bosses' pockets, and they are using that money, a lot of it, to fund the hyper-exploitation of people in other parts of the world. Something that I think it's interesting to think about is the successes of past labor organizers and how we owe it to them that we have such things as weekends, OSHA, and child labor laws. All of these modest improvements had to be fought for, and if our progenitors didn't give their blood, sweat, tears, and often their lives for these advances, there's no reason to think that the capitalists would have come up with these on their own without anyone pressuring them to. Now, if the labor movement of the past successfully overthrew capitalism altogether and the wage system, millions of lives wouldn't have been lost in capitalist wars and capitalism-induced environmental collapse. I'm personally not historically informed enough to take a stance on whether or not a complete overthrow of capitalism would have been possible in the past, given the material and social conditions of the time. And I definitely don't want that sentiment to sound like a diminishment of our gratitude for them. But it does make me think of how hopefully future generations will look back at the anti-capitalist movements of our time and whether or not we could have dismantled capitalism altogether, or if the few reforms we got were all that were possible. Another thing to consider, though, is how much time we have left to work toward wage abolition before our planet is made unlivable by our current capitalist system. Lives are needlessly being lost and biodiversity choked out of existence every day capitalism is allowed to exist. Whether or not the nature of gradualist reform can make changes quickly enough to do away with the capitalist wage system should be a matter of active discussion, because corporate pledges to cut emissions by 50% by the year 2050 obviously aren't going to cut it. The IWW, a revolutionary organization, refers to the sentiment, a fair day's wages for a fair day's work, as a conservative motto. Meanwhile, the Fabian Society, which we mentioned before as explicit in their goal to end the wage system, at least at the time of their signing of the 1890 Manifesto of English Socialists, tends to espouse tactics of gradual reform to bring about change rather than revolutionary action. What I want to point out with this contrast, though, is that there are active organizations that you can join to get the ball rolling. Regardless of which side of the reform versus revolution debate that you fall on, remember that the easiest thing to do is nothing, and we certainly can't afford to do nothing. These matters aren't simply matters of theory, and we need every bit of support we can get against the dictatorship of capital.
All right. So that's our basic presentation. And by the way, these slides are available and can be made available. If anyone wants them, they can email us at our Solidarity Collective email address. We will also make them available on our various event pages on social media, and as well as other materials, readings and links and other educational materials that people might have. But right now, we would invite folks to ask questions that they might have. The easiest way to ask those questions would be to type them in the chat, and we can take them in the order that they come in. And before the presentation even began, some folks, knowing that we were making the presentation, had some questions about this. Now, Glenn Houlihan has a question that says, what literature would you recommend to looking into wage abolition further in terms of books and articles? And I actually have a small list that I've made just of the basic Marxist works on that, and I'm going to copy and paste that here in just a minute. In the meantime, though, I wanted to present this question maybe to Sean and to anyone else who wanted to try to answer it. And that is, the question is one of incentives, and it's kind of a devil's advocate question, I guess. Those who are in favor of a wage system and in favor of wage work often say that people will not work without material incentives. The current debate about unemployment benefits has featured this argument that people are not taking jobs that are available because those jobs those jobs don't pay as much as unemployment benefits do. I don't know if that's true or not, but the question that I have is, what do you say to people who believe that you need the incentives of the wage system in order to get them to go to work?
Oh, sorry, you dropped out there for a bit, but I got the gist. Yeah, I think wages being like a tiny percentage of what people actually produce sort of illustrates that the products of your labor and the products of other people's labor collaboratively, those are the incentives you need. Getting a fraction of that means less of an incentive to actually produce stuff than producing stuff for yourself and for other people around you, and them producing stuff for you. So I think you could say that humans want fulfilling work to do, or that it comes naturally to them, but I think the fact that wages are such a small slice of what you actually produce as a person, what we all actually produce, that abolishing the wage system means more, not less. It means having control over what we produce, not just making people work for nothing. And I think that democratic aspect to it makes abolition of the wage system more appealing rather than less appealing.
Another participant says I think in response to that question, Matthew says there's actually been a number of studies demonstrating that large monetary rewards for performance either have no impact or actually reduce performance the larger the incentive, especially when any kind of mental faculty are involved in that kind of labor. Did you want to expand on that, Matthew, or have others do that?
Hi, sorry. No, I think I pretty much said what I wanted to on that. I can find the study or studies if people are interested, but it's very interesting. These have been in psychology. People have done experiments on monetary rewards for different kinds of tasks, different types of labor, and they found, as I said, that there's like a small improvement in labor when it's like highly physical manual labor, but the moment any sort of task starts involving any kind of thinking, and it doesn't even have to be super complicated, it actually increasing the reward actually causes poorer performance, amazingly.
That is very interesting. Thank you for sharing it. And yeah, I know, speaking for myself, I would love to see that site either during or even after the program. Thank you so much for bringing it up. if there are no other questions right now, I wanted to throw a question to everyone and anyone who wanted to speak on this. And that is, what are people's opinions of UBI, Universal Basic Income? One of the things that I briefly mentioned in the presentation were that it seems like in the present system, at least, UBI might create things like rent seeking or increase in prices, even things like hyperinflation. But those seems like sort of political contingency questions. They don't seem to really get to the meat of that question. Now, one participant, again, Matthew, says, I'm very concerned that leftists fighting for UBI can be caught into an ultimately counterproductive right-wing trap. What do some of the rest of us think about UBI?
I think, as far as I'm concerned, some of the political contingency concerns are some of the first things that I think of. Like, if we're given a few $1,000s every month, what's to stop all of the landlords from all of a sudden increasing rent by a few $1,000s? And so I guess like UBI seems to be a system where it's a reform where the capitalists are still retain control of the economy. And I guess there could be other things added to that, like the government imposed price controls to counter the potential inflation. But I think something like universal access to basic services like housing, food, clean water, and healthcare is something that I feel is superior to universal monetary assistance.
Yeah, really good point. I would say it seems to me that UBI would necessitate its own set of workers' struggles. So if we instituted UBI, we would have to have a struggle against rent and against raising rents. And we would have to have struggles for price controls and struggles against all of the negative externalities of UBI. And all of these would be ultimately class struggles, as well as obviously struggles along other kind of power axes, but definitely class struggles. And so kind of the simple answer to that is, well, if we're going to have class struggles no matter what we do, then maybe we should fight for UBI, or maybe we should fight, as Derek says, for a system of kind of a public option for everything sort of system, or perhaps the collectivization and socialization and even nationalization of some of these basic industries anyway.
Yeah, as someone who's on disability, I often see a lot of these like UBI proposals under capitalism to be like underhanded ways of slashing other social services. So I definitely agree with what Derek was saying about like access to services being preferable. But yeah, I think it's like a marginal like improvement in and of itself. But yeah, agree with Matt also that like it's part of a broader struggle and can't be taken as an end in itself.
A little earlier, I posted some books that have been helpful to me on understanding both the wage system and also alternatives to the wage system, particularly those centered around worker control. So I included Karl Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, and specifically the third manuscript, Human Requirements and Division of Labor Under the Rule of Private Property, as a specific essay in that volume of economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. Also, Value, Price, and Profit, which I feel like we've quoted from pretty extensively or paraphrased pretty extensively in parts of our presentation today. Also, of course, the Communist Manifesto, which I think is an interesting juxtaposition or companion piece to the preamble of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. I always like to include Proudhon's What is Property, even though there's a lot of debate between various schools of thought represented by these various authors. What is Property, or an inquiry into the principle of right and government, in which Proudhon says property is theft. Couple of books on workers' control, and there's many others, and I've actually inadvertently left off some even better ones that I will post on our event page. But there's Jeffrey Ostergaard's The Tradition of Workers' Control, and John Curl's very important, almost encyclopedic description of cooperatives in America called For All the People. And then add to that a link that Matthew has put at the bottom of the chat on the negative correlation between reward size and performance. And I like this because we might not know scientifically what that, whether there is a traceable relationship or an inverse relationship, but the important thing is it's problematized. It's not something that we can just say thoughtlessly that wages or higher material rewards necessarily coheres to human motivation. The way in which pro-capitalist folks so glibly make that connection. And the fact that there's research that suggests otherwise, just as there is also some scientific research on the ways in which altruism is hardwired into humans. All of these things, I think, are really important to that. And Matt also adds a recommendation for Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution from 1930 as another book. I also read a little bit while preparing for this presentation on the way in which the Soviets retained a wage system because they openly believed that that wage system was necessary due to incentives, that it was necessary to incentivize human productivity through the continuation of the wage system. I think that that's very debatable. And one wonders if that's one of the vestiges of wages that the Soviets incorporated that ultimately maybe served to help break down and undermine the success of socialism in that country and in other countries where the wage system was retained without any kind of radical transformation of it. So these are all really good questions. And it sounds like, Matthew, you have one more question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what your all thoughts are on this need to abolish money in order to get rid of the wage system and, you know, sort of replace it with something that can't be exchanged, like a voucher system with expirations on it. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I have heard about this. I would love to see, I would maybe have to study it a little bit more. I know that in the work I did for the public banking movement and other like monetary and radical sort of fiscal reform movements, there was always a contingent of people that said we could actually eliminate paper money and the notion of fungible or transferable money as part of that. But I never paid enough attention to it to have anything really intelligent to say about it.
I know, well, like Matt, I don't have anything super detailed to say. I know Marx was pretty down on replacing like money with labor vouchers, but I do think there's a need eventually to abolish exchange value as a category and produced for use rather than some like accumulation of exchange value for the sake of accumulating even more exchange value. But yeah, I don't have anything intelligent to say beyond that.
Well, I've put that phrase in the chat, abolition of exchange value and transition to production for use, so that curious people wanting to geek out on this question can copy and paste it into a search engine or just into their own notes, so that we can all kind of research this question ourselves. I'll give us a minute to see if anyone else has any questions or thinks of any other questions or comments. While we're waiting for that, I promised to put the email for Southeast Wyoming DSA, who graciously co-sponsored and co-promoted tonight's event. It's SEWYDSA@protonmail.com. Southeast Wyoming DSA has about 50 members currently in the Cheyenne and Laramie area, and we are also working with other groups throughout Wyoming, northern Wyoming, and central Wyoming to establish organizing committees and eventually, hopefully, chapters in those parts of Wyoming as well. We want to thank everyone for coming to our little presentation, the basics of wage abolition and the wage abolition movement. Obviously, the industrial workers of the world is a source that everyone can universally peruse and talk to folks in IWW about how they conceive of the relationship between industrial unionism, the concept of one big union, and the goal of that one big union, which is the abolition of the wage system. We owe a lot to the IWW for keeping that idea alive in the politics of American labor and American radical labor. So on behalf of our co-hosts at Southeast Wyoming DSA, as well as our hosts at Solidarity Collective and Solidarity House Cooperative tonight, I thank everyone who attended via Zoom and also everyone watching on all of the live streams. Keep watching and stay tuned to Solidarity House Cooperative for more productions like this, more forums like this. We have everything from the fight for 15 to the abolition of the wage system and everything in between. And that's what we're all about here. Again, thank you everyone very much for coming. And we hope to see some of you at future organizing. And we think that Marx also discusses labor vouchers in the beginning of the Grundrisse. Again, we can share some of the various sources and various sites that have been helpful to us on our event page. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.